Welcome to Biblio Cultist, where I review books that I find interesting in the topics of religion, philosophy, history, and literature. In this episode, I'll go into a book that influenced nations across the world and had a very powerful political impact, which is The Little Red Book by Mao Zedong. But before I begin, remember to subscribe to my channel if you like the content, like the video, share the video, and click the bell for notifications if you want to get notices when I put out a new video, and comment on the video if you have anything to share. So The Little Red Book, which is technically called Quotations from Chairman Mao Zedong. It was originally published in 1964, and this edition I'm looking through it, I don't have an actual date of publication, so I don't know exactly when my edition was published. It is probably written at the back end looking at the book, but it is in Chinese, so of course I can't read it. But it is a translation, of course. It has the original language in the translation. So I always wanted to have a very nice copy of this book because it is such an impactful book in history, and I wanted to have a copy that at least felt as close as possible to the original. So not exactly an original, but pretty close, and I'm satisfied with this edition. And I think it's very easy to find, so just do your best to go online and try to find a Little Red Book and, in a very nice edition. They're not expensive at all. So, published in 1964 by Lin Biao, it impacted the culture in China, and it generated the Cultural Revolution in China in 1966, which was basically Mao's attempt to redirect Chinese socialism away from capitalism and away from bureaucratic influence. So he was trying to reassert his influence in the party because he felt that China was deviating from the correct philosophy. So the publication of the Little Red Book is the one that basically got to the students, the famous or infamous, however you want to see it, Red Guards, who with the Red Book in their hand went out into the streets and created a second revolution, which is again known as the Cultural Revolution. So when it comes to books, it is difficult to find another book in history that was so powerfully impactful. You can see the pictures, you can see the paintings of the young Red Guards going out into the streets with the Little Red Book and almost using it as a Bible, beating people over the head that they consider deviants from the proper interpretation of socialism. So, as a channel dedicated to books, this is a very classic and impactful book for sure. It is a highly doctrinal work. It is basically quotations. It's not really a book on philosophy or political theory. I remember when I read this book in my early college years, not given by the university, it's just a book that I wanted to read. I was expecting something like that. I was expecting a political theory book, but it's just a book of aphorisms from Mao. I mean, it's a collection of different sayings, different speeches, different articles, kind of placed together, and makes it actually a very easy read and a very compact ideological work, which I understand why it was so useful, because you just wanted to have the core ideas presented so that you could easily counteract what they consider to be deviations from the correct doctrine. Certain points in the book that I want to mention: the positive viewpoint on the national struggle, patriotism, usually called patriotic socialism or socialism with a patriotic bent on it, or the national form of socialism, which is a theory that developed from the Soviet Union about socialism with national characteristics. And obviously Mao took this idea further into the realm of anti-imperialist struggle, because unlike Russia, China had the particular characteristic of being under colonial rule or colonial domination, so that the struggle became more poignant, more significant to them, because it was a struggle for national liberation, which usually contains national patriotic character. So there's a component of nationalism in the form of socialism that is being presented there, so that Mao has to go into some kind of detail to make a distinction between what a lot of traditional Marxist-Leninists would call bourgeois nationalism and what they developed into what would be patriotic socialism. Now, of course, this gets into the topic of National Socialism, because this is a term that now has become anathema to associate with anyone, because it is associated with the Third Reich and the Second World War. But the truth of the matter is that this term pre-existed the German experience of this term, and it usually meant a form of socialism with a national characteristic. So Mao believes in socialism on each country, not socialism with national characteristics, and therefore patriotism is an inherent part of Maoism. And as a matter of fact, it influenced North Korea, for example, and the Cuban Revolution, and many others that were fighting against colonialism. So the anti-colonial movements adopted patriotism as an inherent part of their socialism. And you see this in this book, so that's why I'm mentioning this. Is interesting. Another point that is interesting is that contradictions of an ideological nature. Mao makes it clear that he believes should be settled democratically through an internal debate and internal party struggle, so that things that are in the practical realm, they just are. So that comes from the dialectic materialism of Hegel and Marx. But ideological struggles, which are more in, I would say, the ethereal aspect of the mind and of ideas, should be democratically discussed and debated. And of course, this leads into the management of internal dissent and struggle, which is part of what in that world is called democratic centralism. The other point that I've always found very fascinating, and I didn't catch it when I was younger and I read it, but when I reread the book years later, is the harmony that he posits is possible between the national bourgeois and the working class vis-a-vis the imperialist, internationalist bourgeois. So what people today would call globalists. Mao is saying, well, we can have a national bourgeois that participates in the struggle for socialism within the country, as long as they accept the position of being in a dictatorship of the proletariat. So the national bourgeois can exist, basically, as long as it's patriotic and it's within the context of participating in the new state, in the new revolutionary government. So that is very particular, because if you read further back into those theories, the very notion of a national bourgeois that is friendly instead of being antagonistic is particularly different. So it's a book of quotes. So obviously I would like to read a quote. Now this quote I've always found interesting, and a lot of people use this quote in many different ways. I've seen people quote Mao on this particular topic. They usually just say a line or two, but I'll quote it in full. Quote, "War is the continuation of politics. In this sense, war is politics, and war itself is a political action. Since ancient times, there has never been a war that did not have a political character." End of quote. And of course, as we know, this is very, very true, irrespective of what you think of Mao or of his ideology. It is a fact that war is simply a continuation of politics. So it's a very pragmatic quote, has been used a lot of times, and it is very, very true. And it changes the notion of war, because a lot of people in the West think of war as a method of persuasion, a method of expansion, or even as a methodology of expanding markets. That's how they see it. We need oil, or we want to sell our products. These people don't want to buy our products, so we will expand our influence via military intervention. That reminds me of how the American Navy bombarded Japan in the early 19th century to convince them to open their markets so they could sell products. So that's using the mercantile naval power, military aggression as a method of expanding capitalism. So obviously, I mention this because it reminds me of this critique of capitalism, but it's inverted by understanding war as a political tool, which again, even the financial utilization of military intervention has a political component without a doubt. And another point related to war is that war is decided by people and not by weapons, which I also believe is very true. You can have all the fancy weapons you want, but without the capacity of putting boots on the ground and actually taking control of a territory, it doesn't matter how many fancy weapons you have, you will lose. And Romans understood this. It doesn't matter how much Greek fire they had and how many fancy naval ships they had. None of this mattered if they couldn't put boots on the ground. And this has been demonstrated by almost every single modern war that we have seen in which the United States has engaged in and has been unable to win. All the way from Vietnam, although some people would argue even Korea because it was a standstill. But Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. No matter how many drones, no matter how many satellites, no matter how many fancy weapons, if you cannot hold the line on the ground with people, you cannot win. You will lose every single time. And Russia also learned this lesson in Afghanistan, by the way. So it applies to any imperial power who goes out and tries to impose their will. Unless they do it with a large amount of soldiers, they simply will not be able to win. And finally, one of the last points I want to mention, because it's interesting, is the theological aspect of the book. So the book is a book on political theory, but it also has a viewpoint on life. I would say the most socialist experiments in the East have a Taoist component. You see that in Korea, you see that in China, and you see that also in Vietnam, in my personal opinion. So this book feels to me almost like a Taoist work. And then before any Taoist gets angry because I'm saying this, I'm simply stating this on the presentation and on the dynamics of how life and death are treated. For example, he treats life and death as only being meaningful if they're within the context of the people. So the people take a characteristic, a theological characteristic, from which human beings can derive meaning in life and meaning in death. And this concept of transcendence within a movement that most people believe is atheistic is very impactful. And this is why I've always found the merging of politics and religion to be so fascinating. So hopefully you found this review to be entertaining in some way, and that it motivates you to get this book and read it. It's not very long, but I think you will derive a lot of knowledge from it, and also it will give you a window into the mindset of the Cultural Revolution and into understanding China anyway. And like I said, I enjoyed the book when I was younger, and I still enjoy the book because of its revolutionary ethos. So remember to subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, and comment on the video if you like it. See you next time.